Well, you recently did an edition focused on Vietnam's late General Secretary Nguyen Trong and his passing. He passed away on Friday, July 19th. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was supposed to attend Trong's memorial in Hanoi last week. He canceled at the last minute so he could attend a White House meeting with visiting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And let me read you a tweet from Boston College Vietnam political scientist Kang Vu, who wrote, quote, Secretary of State Blinken missing General Secretary Trong's funeral is not making the U.S. look good in the eyes of Vietnamese netizens. Some pointed out that the U.S. is the only comprehensive strategic partner that did not send a high-ranking delegation to the funeral. Let's contrast that with President Xi Jinping's response. Within hours, mere hours of General Secretary Trong's passing, Xi went personally to the Vietnamese embassy in Beijing, flanked by the Communist Party's top diplomat, Laotian and also Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. That is some heavy firepower.
I think one thing that I'm really struck by, Eric, particularly in Washington, I think you see a lot of fixation with the kind of security and military aspects of this, right? So, the China-Philippine confrontations and so on and so forth, a lot of stuff that comes out in the headlines, particularly in Western media. But I think if you get to Manila and you have kind of private conversations with officials, the kind of things they're worried about are actually more sort of bread and butter issues. So if you look at the State of the Nation address that President Ferdinand Marcos delivered, really the first section that he talked about wasn't about geopolitical issues, wasn't about security issues. It was about inflation and food prices. And he really hit home on those issues. Foreign policy and a lot of these issues were not as prominent, relatively speaking. And that reflects the fact that if you talk to most Filipinos on the ground, those are actually the big issues and concerns that they have. It's not about confronting China in the South China Sea. That's very important, not because the South China Sea doesn't matter. It does. And I think the Philippine public, more so in the last year or so, given the Marcos administration, is much more aware of the stakes that are at play.
The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and today we're going to head back to my neighborhood in Southeast Asia. This, when you look across the world at where the great power competition is playing out, nowhere is it happening with the intensity that is happening in Southeast Asia, and there's a lot going on. Today we're going to talk about three topics with just one of the best experts in this space. First, we're going to talk about the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting that's underway now, and lots of heavy hitters are there. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is there. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken passed through town, and then Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was there, as well as the ASEAN foreign ministers as well. And we're going to talk about the South China Sea, which is one of the issues that those ministers are trying to address. Then we're going to talk about the legacy of the late Communist Party General Secretary Nguyen Trong, who passed away on Friday, July 19th, and in part because he was one of the architects of Vietnam's foreign policy, the so-called bamboo diplomacy, and there's a lot of geopolitics involved with his passing as well, and we're going to look forward to maybe what comes next. And then finally, we're going to end our discussion today on what's happening in the South China Sea, specifically around the Second Thomas Shoal, where China and the Philippines have reportedly come to some kind of an agreement. We don't know the terms of that agreement because they haven't been published, but there is an agreement that it's been reached, and we're going to get some perspective on that. And the best person to give us those perspectives is the ASEAN Wonk himself, Prashanth Paramaswaran, who writes the indispensable ASEAN Wonk Substack newsletter. And if you're not subscribed to it, you must be. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Prashanth, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you here.
Good to be with you, Eric, and thanks so much for the kind introduction.
It's great to have you here. I've been looking forward to our discussion for quite some time, in part because there is so much to talk about. Let's first start with the ASEAN foreign ministers gathering that's taking place in Vientiane, Laos. It's coming at a very interesting time, in part because of everything that's happening in the South China Sea. The South China Sea is one of the major issues on the agenda. Myanmar is also a major topic on the agenda. The key question that everybody has is that, is ASEAN, in all its complexity, is that the right forum to be handling some of these issues when, in fact, ASEAN itself has, in the past, really resisted taking a frontline role in some of these more contentious issues? So let's first start with the foreign ministers meeting. What are you looking at, in part because this falls right into your area of expertise in terms of ASEAN diplomacy?
So I think for the ASEAN foreign ministers meetings and kind of related meetings that are going to be happening on the sidelines, you're right, Eric, in the sense that the twin flashpoints in Southeast Asia are really in the headlines, which is Myanmar and the South China Sea. I think with the South China Sea, the big question is going to be, last year we did see ASEAN, and you're right, I mean, ASEAN is just one forum where the South China Sea issue is sort of discussed. These countries have individual kind of tracks with China. They also cooperate with each other. They work with the U.S., Japan, and other countries as well. But there was at least an effort by Indonesia to kind of at least salvage the diplomatic process and put it back on track last year during their chairmanship. And this year, we have Laos in the chairmanship seat. And next year, we're going to have Malaysia. And I think the big question there is, to what extent are we going to actually see, on an ASEAN basis, some sort of diplomatic agreement, any kind of series of protocols that can be reached on an ASEAN-wide basis? There's a long effort that's decades old, in fact, to sort of conclude a binding code of conduct on the South China Sea. That's been very difficult to achieve, but there are kind of incremental steps that Southeast Asian countries are trying to take along the way. Indonesia started it, and Malaysia is going to be in the hot seat next year in 2025. I think the other one is Myanmar, which, you know, it's a very concerning situation. Concerning situation to varying degrees, because Myanmar, some of the countries like Thailand are located, you know, on the border with Myanmar. Other countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, they're a little bit further out, but they do have stakes in the Myanmar issue to varying degrees, whether it's the diplomatic track or the fact that Rohingya refugees from Myanmar have flowed into Malaysia and Indonesia, and you're starting to see a little bit of resentment building up at the domestic level. There's a lot of speculation as to what's going to happen politically within Myanmar. You hear a lot of speculation about potentially whether long and multiple postponed elections might actually be held sometime in 2025. And if that happens, that's going to be another item that Malaysia is going to have to deal with under its chairmanship. But even if elections are not held, essentially ASEAN is kind of in a holding pattern with respect to Myanmar. Myanmar's been suspended. It was supposed to hold the chairmanship soon after. Malaysia in 2026, ASEAN has suspended Myanmar from holding the chairmanship in this kind of alphabetically rotating system that they have. But there are a whole host of other issues that have not been resolved, including the sort of 5-point consensus that ASEAN has on Myanmar related to talks, humanitarian assistance, and so on and so forth. Those issues haven't been addressed. Political representation of the junta in some of the ASEAN meetings, that's another thing that's being discussed as well. So lots to follow on both counts in the ASEAN meetings that we're seeing.
And while ASEAN has been a difficult place for people to talk about the Myanmar fighting, China has been actively involved in trying to find some kind of resolution. Remember, a lot of the fighting is happening up on the Shan state, which is northern Myanmar, right along the Chinese border. And quite a few of the junta leaders have been making their way to Beijing to talk about some of the peace talks, or not peace talks, but at least some of the resolutions that they've tried to introduce to calm some of the fighting that's there. South China Sea, you mentioned the fact that next year it's going to be heading towards Malaysia in terms of the chairmanship. South China Sea is going to be a major topic, no doubt, next year as well. Anwar Ibrahim, though, the prime minister in Malaysia, has been very vocal in the past year or so in saying, listen, vilifying the Chinese and taking the approach that the Philippines has taken towards the Chinese is not what we're going to do here. We don't agree with the Americans either that the Chinese are the aggressor, if you will, and they've taken a decidedly different approach in managing South China Sea relations than, say, the Philippines or some of the other claimants. What does that spell for ASEAN in terms of its ability to manage some of these crises if there are such divergent views on the South China Sea between, say, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. in Manila and Anwar Ibrahim in Kuala Lumpur?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think you're right to note that there are kind of different and diverging views and interests among these various Southeast Asian countries, including on the South China Sea. I think often there is a focus on the kind of ASEAN or aggregate Southeast Asia level, but a lot of these developments are very domestic in nature. So in the Philippines, for example, there's a lot of focus on things like Second Thomas Shoal, the sort of U.S.-Philippine alliance, the Mutual Defense Treaty. But I just returned from a trip to several Southeast Asian countries, including the Philippines and Vietnam. If you go to the Philippines, you head out of Manila, you travel to other places like the southern parts of the country, which is, the stronghold of the previous president, Rodrigo Duterte. The big concern there is really the economics of things like food prices, the sort of almost dynastic sort of rivalries between Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and the Dutertes now that are playing out in the Philippines. So a lot of it is less on the military side and more on the economic and political side. And so you see these dynamics at play in Malaysia as well. So the South China Sea, of course, is an important issue. Malaysians pay attention to it. It's in the newspapers, it's in the headlines. You can't ignore it. But I think all throughout Southeast Asia, if you look at various indicators that we have, the metrics that we have, for example, the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore publishes an annual survey that shows, what issues are the most important to Southeast Asian elites. And even there, even if it's an elite conversation, you see a lot of the other issues like unemployment, economic issues, climate change. These factor much more on a sort of more urgent basis and a more important basis relative to flashpoints like the South China Sea. I think the Philippines is the exception here because we've seen a lot of focus on it in the past few months. But largely speaking, you see this dynamic across Southeast Asia. And I think in Malaysia, you're right to note the rhetoric of Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, who, I think if you talk to Malaysian officials on my latest trip there, they'll tell you very frankly, including people who advise him, he is a prime minister, but he also has a long record of being an activist and actually somebody who was in the political opposition. So he actually cares about a lot of these issues and has different kind of stakes and equities relative to a normal politician, right? So you'll see the passing of a major kind of Southeast Asian academic. And, he's the only prime minister who's going to be putting out a statement on that, right, on his personal social media accounts. So a lot of the things that Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim says about the United States and China and South China Sea, I think they're important because he does have that sort of moral sort of rectitude and a sense of caring for these issues beyond just being a politician. But I also think it's really important to distinguish between what Malaysia is saying and what Malaysia is doing. So if you look at what Malaysia is actually doing, they've tried very hard, actually, in spite of the fact that they've moved closer to China, to actually try to get the United States to do more. They've actually tightened a lot of their security collaboration with Japan. They strengthened and elevated their defense ties last year. They had earlier this year an exercise close to the South China Sea that they did right after that elevation. They've tried to look at building other relationships as well, including with Australia and other countries in the region. So I would say in general, Malaysia kind of typifies the kind of mentality that you see in Southeast Asia, which is to tend to approach these security issues very comprehensively. And then to also look at various partnerships. So not just the United States and China, but also Japan, Australia, India, so on and so forth. And that's, I think, where the countries in the region are.
Now, you mentioned that you spent some time in the Philippines and in Vietnam. We're going to get to Vietnam later in our discussion. But tell me, what was the word on the street? What were you hearing when you were in Manila? What were people talking about in terms of the South China Sea?
I think one thing that I'm really struck by, Eric, particularly in Washington, I think you see a lot of fixation with the kind of security and military aspects of this, right? So, the China-Philippine confrontations and so on and so forth, a lot of stuff that comes out in the headlines, particularly in Western media. But I think if you get to Manila and you have kind of private conversations with officials, the kind of things they're worried about are actually more sort of bread and butter issues. So if you look at the State of the Nation address that President Ferdinand Marcos delivered, really the first section that he talked about wasn't about geopolitical issues, wasn't about security issues. It was about inflation and food prices. And he really hit home on those issues. Foreign policy and a lot of these issues were not as prominent, relatively speaking. And that reflects the fact that if you talk to most Filipinos on the ground, those are actually the big issues and concerns that they have. It's not about confronting China in the South China Sea. That's very important, not because the South China Sea doesn't matter. It does. And I think the Philippine public more so in the last year or so, given the Marcos administration, is much more aware of the stakes that are at play. But these issues are inherently connected, right? So for the Marcos administration, their big challenge is not, do I activate the mutual defense treaty with the U.S. or not, right? As if it's sort of some switch that's going to be turned on or turned off. It's a much more complex, sophisticated discussion about, on the one hand, what do we need from the United States, but also, frankly, what do we need from other countries, right? So the Philippines now has gone on this really global offensive, right? The series of security and defense pacts that they've signed and are planning to finalize with countries like France, Canada, and so on and so forth, right? New Zealand, right? So across 4 different continents, you have the Philippines engaging in these discussions. So it's not just a U.S.-centric discussion. That's important to keep in mind because the Philippines is also, like all the countries in Southeast Asia, aware that with every U.S. election, you have to ask fundamental questions about the sustainability and durability of U.S. commitment. And so the best way to confront that is to engage the United States, but also engage other partners, given the fact that you're trying to hedge for various possibilities or eventualities. So that's on the U.S. side. And then on the China side, yes, the Philippines has had a number of run-ins with China, but the big question that you hear from opponents of Marcos on the ground is, how much of the Philippines actually losing in terms of economic opportunities with China that other Southeast Asian countries are gaining on a competitive or relative basis, right? So the Marcos administration has to be aware about how it's making these arguments, not just from a national security perspective, but also from an economic perspective, from a diplomatic perspective, and also being very aware of the domestic narratives about these issues, more so than the geopolitical questions that we talk about.
Well, on the trade front, even though, much like it is with the United States, even though there are bitter tensions between China and the Philippines, trade volumes have remained rather stable, which is surprising. But I think the concern, as you point out, is that there's going to be opportunity costs maybe in the future in terms of FDI and some of the other infrastructure projects that a lot of China's critics in the Philippines say have not materialized. And so also just being out of China's orbit economically could cost the Philippines quite a bit. It's interesting you brought up this question of former President Duterte and the rivalries that exist domestically within the Philippines. I was talking to an ASEAN scholar the other day, and he said one of the reasons why the Chinese are a bit more pragmatic about the Philippines is because of the nature of Philippine presidential politics. So just as you mentioned in the United States, where we have one administration that may be Republican and it takes one approach and another one is Democrat and they take another approach. Well, the same is true in the Philippines, that over the next, say, 5, 10, 15 years, we're going to see different administrations come into power who possibly will have very different approaches to China. There's not a consensus in the Philippines about how to deal with China, even on these issues of the South China Sea. When you hear that perspective from this ASEAN scholar, what's your thought in terms of whether that's accurate and whether that's consistent with what you've also seen in your discussions with Filipino policymakers and scholars?
I think, Eric, you're sort of spot on with the observation you cited about the sort of concerns about sustainability of different policies and strategies that we see in Southeast Asia. Over the past year, for various projects with the Wilson Center and other institutions, including work for ASEAN Wonk, I had a chance to speak to officials from all 11 of these countries in Southeast Asia. I traveled to 10 of them, with the exception of Myanmar, given some of the sensitivities there. And I think across the board, this is a major question that people are asking. So on the one hand, yes, a focus on election cycles of outside powers, including the United States, but also given what the Philippines has been doing under Ferdinand Marcos Jr. recently, the question of how sustainable this is within a particular administration, that's particularly, it happens in all of these Southeast Asian countries to various degrees. They have different political systems. But in the Philippines, it's particularly unique because the Philippines has a single 6-year term for the presidency. So there's no kind of second term, right? So essentially, the dynamic that you've had in recent years is you had President Aquino come in the first part of the 2010s. And, he had one approach to the South China Sea, which is very much closer to the United States, inculcating alliances, more exercises, a bit of skepticism towards China. You had Duterte, who came in, who essentially did a 180, right? Approaching China very closely, looking at economic assistance, didn't really pan out for various reasons. And now we have Marcos essentially going back to something that approximates more the Aquino approach, but on a more global basis. And I think there's a lot more urgency there that you're seeing from the Philippine government. So the big question is, after Marcos, what are things going to look like? There's not a lot of certainty there in terms of Philippine politics. I think if you look at the two essential dynasties that have been in the headlines, the Marcos dynasty and the Duterte dynasty, and you look at the fact that the vice president of Marcos, Sara Duterte, who's the daughter of Duterte, people might be tempted to say, oh, we're going to go back to something like Rodrigo Duterte in a few years, right? And maybe there are some countries, including, some in China, that may be betting on that scenario. But I would caution against that only because Sara Duterte has very different views from her father. She's made those, some of those are public, some of those are not so public. And so I would be very cautious about sort of saying that this is going to look like something that was in the past with Duterte. I think we're going to see a different approach. I would also caution to say that Philippine politics is a very complicated series of dynamics. I don't necessarily think that just because Sara Duterte is in the headlines and we're seeing a lot of these dynastic politics now, that's going to eventually be what we're going to see in the next sort of term. And Marcos still has a long way to go. How Marcos starts out on his policy and approach towards the South China Sea, China and the United States may not necessarily be how he ends up.
He's got about 4 more years left on his term, right? That's a long time in politics.
That's right. And we're also looking at midterm elections next year in the Philippines in 2025, which will be very revealing in terms of telling us his support, but also the various kinds of maneuverings that we see in the Philippine domestic political sphere as we look at that. And that's part of the reason why I mentioned that, Marcos's real vulnerability, if you look at polls and surveys that have been done since he took office, and I monitor these very closely, it's a consistent trend. He's doing really well on issues like the South China Sea, alignments, foreign policy, and so on and so forth. Where he's not doing well is on economic issues, inflation and things like that. So I think any strategy or effort to understand the strategy in the Philippines needs to begin with understanding those realities rather than beginning from the perspective of looking at, confrontations between China and the Philippines and the South China Sea.
Well, let's dive into those confrontations. A lot has happened since the last time we spoke with you, and certainly over the past, say, 5 or 6 weeks. Let's dial back the clock to June 17th. Many of you will remember that was, in many ways, the apex so far in this confrontation that started back in February 2023. So we're about 18, 19 months now into this confrontation between the Philippines and China in the South China Sea over territorial access. And what happened on June 17th was by far the most confrontational. In fact, violence was used. They were using, sticks and hatchets. And one of the Philippine Navy sailors had their thumbs cut off. And this really sparked a lot of discussion and reflection, not only in Manila, but also in Washington and in Beijing and elsewhere about where do we go from here? So it took people by surprise a little bit, at least me, and I'd be curious you, when we heard a couple weeks ago that the two sides had reached some sort of agreement on the second Thomas Shoal. Now, we need to be very, very precise here. This agreement that we're going to talk about is not about the larger South China Sea dispute between the Philippines and China. It is specifically about resupplying the BRP Sierra Madre, which is this decrepit World War II era warship that serves as the Philippines' territorial claim over the second Thomas Shoal. I think the Chinese called it Zhenai Reef, and it is, again, the main point of contention. So when you heard about this deal, were you surprised or were you expecting something like this?
So I think the messaging that you saw come from Philippine officials but before this indicated that there were attempts to sort of find some sort of diplomatic off-ramp, given the crisis that we saw between the Philippines and China. And so, it's less a question of sort of whether the agreement was actually struck as to the specifics of that agreement, Eric. And as you noted, the other thing that's important to keep in mind is that this is a very specific and narrow kind of agreement that covers primarily the actions in Second Thomas Shoal and sort of these resupply missions. And so the bigger questions around the Philippines and the South China Sea and the sort of relationships between major powers like China and the United States are, the fact that in the Philippines, the big question would be the longer term strategy of the Philippines has been essentially, you've seen over the past 2 decades, essentially, China essentially come in, and there was an agreement that the United States tried to broker with respect to Scarborough Shoal, and that, ended up not actually working out. China came in and essentially occupied it. If you look further back in history, in the 1990s, the Chinese essentially occupied Mischief Reef. And then the Chinese constructed these artificial islands, right? And the United States, at that time, there were discussions internally within the U.S. government about what to do. But the United States eventually did not choose to actively engage China on these questions, in spite of the fact that there were private and public agreements by China. China made to the United States that it would not actually try to militarize these islands. It went ahead and did that anyway. So from the perspective of some Filipinos, the United States is on strike three with respect to the South China Sea, because you had the incident essentially earlier where the United States tried to broker an agreement, and that didn't work out. And then you had China militarize the artificial islands. So the big question is, if there is a sort of situation where China were to take an actual feature, what would the United States do? And I can't say for certain that any Filipino that I've spoken to is 100% sure about what the United States would do at that point in time, primarily because, as I talked about, a lot of this depends on the specifics of the situation, who's president, and so on and so forth. So there is that question, whether we kind of like to admit it or not publicly, of U.S. commitment that kind of is at play here. The second question is, even though you have this agreement between China and the Philippines, actually subsequently you've had China come out and kind of clarify that actually, no, this is not specifics that we said on the agreement, and so on and so forth. There'll be all kinds of kind of reinterpretations depending on what happens. The big issue, as you correctly pointed out, Eric, at the outset, is we're essentially seeing a rising of the temperatures, and the situation is basically propping up in terms of the escalation levels over time. So we are not at a level of military conflict by any means, but we are in a situation that's different. But I would say, if you're looking at Asia and the Indo-Pacific more broadly, there are some who would draw a parallel between what happened between China and India in the Himalayas, where the Chinese did not use actually armed kind of ammunition, and so it didn't arise to a point of military conflict. But essentially everything short of that was happening, including clubbing, the injuring of soldiers, people dying, and so on and so forth, right? So this is still a very serious issue. So the question is, what does the Philippines do about it, and how are China and the Philippines going to manage this? And for all of the parties involved, China doesn't have an interest in actually pulling the United States into the situation, because that kind of outdoes the asymmetry that it has in engaging with the Philippines, right? So everyone's got to be really careful about how they act. But every time you see an escalation, whether it's water cannons or the boarding of vessels and injuring of particular individuals and personnel, this is something that's going to get more serious. And of course, China's past behavior in the South China Sea tells us that there is a tendency, if this behavior is not checked, to normalize new sorts of behavior, right? So water cannons, we saw that employed once, and then it was done a couple of times after. So the big question is, are we going to see more instances of, boarding or injuring of personnel? I think a lot of us who follow these issues closely hope that that's not the case, but I don't think we can take that for granted just because we have the publicization of this agreement. I think any party can choose to, at one point in time, say, this party has violated it, and we're back to the status quo, and then we're back to where we started.
And as far as you know, the agreement has not been published, though, right? It's still, the details have not been released.
That's right. I mean, the full agreement in terms of the actual text, in terms of publicizing by both sides, has not been published. But there have been accounts that have been given, including by the Philippines Department of Foreign Affairs, right? Their equivalent of a foreign ministry has released.
So what do we know? What do we know about what they're saying in this deal?
I think in terms of the specifics of what they're talking about, there's been a long discussion between the Philippines and China about how can they agree about the terms for resupply missions, right? So the terms for resupply missions, previously, what China has had a particular problem about is China wants the Philippines to telegraph exactly when it is doing these resupply missions. And China wants the Philippines to make sure that it is providing relief and supplies to its sort of outpost in Second Thomas Shoal, but it is not trying to engage in anything that would constitute a sort of reconstruction of Second Thomas Shoal that would reinforce it in any meaningful way. China also wants to make sure that it can avoid a situation where the United States is actually assisting the Philippines in this effort. Now, the agreement specifies some of those conditions, but China has come out and said that it is not its understanding that China is going to allow the Philippines to do these resupply missions willy-nilly, because there's essentially still at the heart of the issue is China still believes that Second Thomas Shoal is something that it claims, and that the Philippines doesn't actually have a rightful claim to it. So in a future scenario where the Second Thomas Shoal as an outpost disintegrates, or perhaps China feels like feels emboldened and wants to take over this feature, it still could, right? In a certain scenario. So I don't think the specifics of the agreements that we've heard so far actually amount to resolving kind of what lies at the heart of this particular issue. One of the other things I wanted to say is there's a lot of things that have been said publicly about this agreement. It's really important for all of us to keep in mind that there are a lot of discussions and actually a lot of military activity that's going on privately, that's happening on the part of China, on the part of the Philippines, the United States, and other countries, right? And some of this has propped up in the public domain. For example, we have seen published in the media, and this is all documented, aerial assistance and monitoring provided by the United States on some of these resupply missions with the Philippines, right? So this idea that, red lines have been crossed, pink lines have been crossed, so on and so forth. I just wanted to plug that for us, that there's a lot about what is going on that we don't actually have full view on. If you talk to officials privately, they will acknowledge that this is what's going on. I think the other thing that I would say is there's a lot to sequencing that matters as well, right? So it is, to my mind at least, based on my conversations, it is no coincidence that we've seen the timing on some of these moves that have been long in the making, but all of a sudden they have surfaced in the public domain as something that has been done. So you had the incident that you mentioned earlier last month between China and the Philippines, but you also had the signing of the Japan-Philippines Security Pact, right, which has long been discussed. But just after this incident that we saw between China and the Philippines, you saw this actually publicized, and then you saw talks between the Philippines and China, bilateral talks that happened in July, which we knew were going to happen even before, but the Philippines publicized those talks right after, right? So there is an effort, I think, on the part of all parties to kind of say, let's cool down the temperature, but the Philippines is also balancing what it's doing with China, with what it's doing with the US, Japan, and other countries. I think there's a very concerted effort by the Philippines to say, we're not the ones who are escalating this. We're trying to find a diplomatic off-ramp. And there's an effort by China and other countries as well to clarify what their positions are.
Let me just give you some of the points, because all of that was really very, very useful. And let me just then kind of come back to you with some of the feedback that I've gotten from my sources about why the two sides decided to reach this deal now. And the timing is very important, as you pointed out. And the presidents are very important, but not just the presidents in Manila, who was president at the time, but also in the White House. So here are 3 reasons, and I'd love to get your take on it, because there is no right or wrong here. This is all somewhat reading tea leaves and interpretive. But number 1 was the construction materials that you talked about. One of the disputes that emerged post-agreement was that there was apparently some kerfuffle that the Chinese want to have the right to board Philippine ships to investigate whether or not they are bringing construction materials to the Sierra Madre. The Philippines Ministry of Defense came out and said they have not agreed to any Chinese boardings under any circumstances of Philippine ships. One of the reasons why some folks say that Manila was ready to negotiate now is because their construction materials, all of that has been brought on already. They've already done the work. The Sierra Madre has been fortified and strengthened. It can withstand typhoons now. And so, you know what? They can say we're only going to bring in humanitarian relief supplies because they're done bringing in construction materials. Number 2, I heard from sources in Washington, well-placed sources in Washington, that said that after June 17th, the Philippines was going to give this one more time to resupply without confrontation. And if there was another confrontation comparable to what happened on June 17th, then the United States would get involved. And what they talked about in terms of U.S. involvement was, how do you resupply the BRP Sierra Madre with U.S. support? So that could be in the form of U.S. Coast Guard cutters accompanying the Philippines. It could come in the form of the U.S. Navy showing up. More likely what they said, though, was that it would be in the form of U.S. helicopters that would be dropping and ferrying supplies to the Sierra Madre. And that posed a particular challenge for the Chinese because there's no way to stop a helicopter delivery short of shooting the helicopter down, which of course is not something that the Chinese want to do at this time. And so, but the Chinese took a very sober view and said, if we get to that point where the Americans are ferrying supplies by helicopter, that could change the dynamics. And the last one, and this is the one I want to get your take on, but all three I want to get your feedback on. Former President Donald Trump on July 16th gave an interview with Bloomberg where he was pretty clear that Taiwan is not going to be a passion of his going forward, and that he has said this in a number of interviews. Marita Bartiromo on Fox Business News asked him the same question as to whether or not he would guarantee Taiwan's defense in the event of a Chinese invasion, and he was ambivalent at best, if not dismissive, and said basically Taiwan has taken our chip technology, and if you were sitting in Taiwan, you should be very, very nervous about whether or not the U.S. commitment to provide defensive weapons and to protect in the event of an invasion is ironclad, as they say in Manila. And my guess is that folks in Manila saw that interview and said, holy cannoli, if they're weak on Taiwan. And he said, remember, Taiwan should pay for American defense. And certainly the Philippines, as you know, don't have the kind of cash that the Taiwanese have, even if that was something on the table, which it's not. So combined, the construction materials already done. The U.S. potentially getting involved now with helicopters, one more chance, and then the dynamics of Washington politics and the lack of commitment potentially from the United States in a future Trump administration, should that happen. All of that came together to bring these two sides to say, you know what, this is the time to deal. That's what my sources tell me. I'd love to get your take on that, whether it's right, wrong, and what you think of those points.
Yeah, I think, a lot of this is rooted in the fact that there are differing interpretations as well in Washington and in Manila about, what constitutes kind of the most efficient and the most plausible scenario in terms of dealing with these situations, right? So, for example, with respect to construction and fortification, as well as resupply missions, the big question here in the United States would be, what is the sort of U.S. role in that situation? And I think if you are somebody who kind of considers the South China Sea as a very kind of important issue for U.S. interests, you would see something like U.S. support for a resupply mission as something that, the United States would do under potentially the Mutual Defense Treaty if China were to do something. And so, that kind of is one perspective. Another perspective would be, if there are ways to do this, and the Philippines, the United States has been very clear that this is something that has to be requested by the Philippines.
That's right.
And
will not be initiated by the Americans. Contrary to what the Chinese are saying, this is in response to a Philippine request. That's a very important point that I think a lot of people overlook.
Exactly. And I think that's a very important point because, as you noted, China has been kind of questioning, the extent of Philippine agency. This is something that's done in Washington and so on and so forth. So I think for the United States, it'd be really important to make sure that the kind of signal is very clearly coming from Manila. However, the complicating factor is that when you look at the signals coming out of Manila and you talk to officials, they sort of say where you stand kind of partly depends on where you sit. So depending on which agency you talk to, keep in mind that the Philippines, the Coast Guard is often in the headlines a lot for a lot of their statements, but there are various stakeholders that are involved, so the defense folks, foreign ministry. And as we see in all of these countries, Eric, it's very important to sort of clarify, who you're speaking to and speak to as many people as possible because they each have their own interests. And so, the sort of in the Philippines about the questions about construction materials, about reinforcement, about resupply missions, you have some folks who are suggesting that the Philippines could actually do a lot more on its own. in terms of reinforcement, work with allies, working and talking more with China, and so on and so forth. And so going back to the conversation about the agreement, there was also news coming out separately about a hotline that was set up between the two leaders, for example, even though the big question with all these hotlines is who's going to pick up the phone, right, in an actual crisis rather than whether these hotlines exist. And then from the other perspective, sort of a lot of frustration about the U.S.-Philippine alliance and the Mutual Defense Treaty, and sort of saying, we've got this alliance with the United States, and if we're having resupply missions that are injuring Philippine personnel, I mean, isn't this kind of a place where the alliance needs to come into effect? And so you have this dynamic going on in both Manila and Washington about, Washington sort of saying, we want a very clear sense from Manila about where the signals are coming from and what you want from us. But there actually is in Manila different interpretations about, how to employ these various tools of statecraft and then how to balance and recalibrate these considerations as well. Keep in mind, of course, both countries are going through elections, right? You have elections here in November in the United States, but you also have midterm elections in the Philippines next year. I won't sort of pretend to speak for any of the two leaders or their administrations, but I don't think any one of these administrations wants the South China Sea and conflict in the South China Sea to be front and center when they're entering into an election campaign, particularly with all the other crises and challenges that are happening now. So I think the tendency that you've seen from U.S. officials is to come out and sort of cool the sort of rhetoric. You've seen a similar dynamic in the Philippines as well. But as you pointed out, I mean, there are a lot of things that are going on behind closed doors, quietly on the water, as well as in diplomatic rooms. And if there is a crisis that breaks out, I know for a fact from my conversations that there are already officials that are very frustrated that options like accompanying Philippine resupply missions is not an option that has already been triggered. But again, that's not something that's new. I remember distinctly during the Obama administration a similar debate about how the U.S. would respond to things that happened in Scarborough Shoal, about artificial island building campaigns, about the ruling that came out that the Philippines filed the case against China when it came out. And so there are always going to be these differences. And so I think it's really important for us to keep in mind kind of the complexities at play. The one thing that you mentioned, the sort of third part of your question on U.S. commitment, I'm of the view that particularly when it comes to, I mean, we've got now two candidates, for Trump, it's confirmed in terms of the Republican side. Kamala Harris looks to be the candidate for the Democratic side, even though the convention hasn't been completed. It looks like she's going to be getting the delegates. And so, we're going to have a policy for the United States on the South China Sea, on the Philippines, on Southeast Asia, and the world. Either case is going to be different from what the Biden administration has been propagating so far. I think in the case of Trump and his rhetoric, I tend to subscribe to the theory that it's very important to look at what Donald Trump does rather than what Donald Trump says, because he says a lot of things, and some of those are for different audiences, constituencies, and interests, and some of them don't really stick. But I do think to your broader point about commitment and U.S. commitment, this is a very, very serious issue. I talked to an ambassador recently who basically told me directly, based on what we see in Southeast Asia about what the United States is doing, it's the equivalent of you having a lame duck U.S. president every 4 years. Right. And so this notion of what to expect from the United States and commitment and so on and so forth is really important for countries that recognize the challenge that China presents, but also hope they get more consistency from the United States. I would also say, not in defense of the Trump presidency or Donald Trump himself, but I would just say as a matter of fact, for the record, the tougher approach that we've seen in terms of U.S. South China Sea policy, including with respect to the Philippines, the Trump administration actually was the one who started this notion of applying the notion of the Mutual Defense Treaty to the South China Sea. It wasn't the Biden administration. So on certain issues, particularly on security issues, actually the Trump administration has shown to be quite tough. I'm actually more worried about the diplomatic and economic and kind of narrative issues that we might see from a second Trump administration that we actually saw a little bit in the first Trump administration. So high-level U.S. officials, including Trump himself, not attending ASEAN summits on a regular basis, which, irrespective of what you think about these summits...
And Biden didn't go either, by the way. Just let's be fair. Biden didn't go to the summit either.
That's true. But at the same time, you did have the Biden administration convene a sort of special U.S.-ASEAN summit here in Washington, D.C., which was the first time in U.S. history. So I think we have to give the Biden administration credit where credit is due. They have really prioritized ASEAN. They elevated the relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership. They were actually thinking about a follow-up summit focused on sectoral issues, including technology. So I think relative to...
Can I push back on you on that one? I mean, after the U.S.-ASEAN summit, the Vietnamese delegation was caught on a hot mic kind of laughing at this. Remember, the output of this was $300 million over, I think, 10 years or 5 or 10 years. And a lot of people walked away from that U.S.-ASEAN summit underwhelmed with what came out of it. A lot of talk, a lot of rhetoric, not a lot of substance that came through with it. And that's been the problem in Southeast Asia, that the Chinese are showing up with railroads. The Chinese are showing up with RCEP trade agreements, the preferential market access. And the Americans are showing up with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which, I mean, come on, nobody's taken this thing seriously because it doesn't include preferential market access into the U.S. After what the Southeast Asians went through to bend into pretzels to get CPTPP passed in their own governments, and then the U.S. bailed on that, and then to see $300 million is coming among 10 or 11 ASEAN countries, mind you. They just felt like this isn't serious.
Right. I mean, I think, Eric, you're not going to get any argument from me about the sort of limits or challenges of U.S. economic policy. I mean, I've written extensively about this, including in ASEAN Wonk, Wilson Center, so on and so forth. But going back to the original point I made about ASEAN, I think it's really important here to kind of grade administrations relative to what they've actually done, right? So in the Trump administration, you saw officials, in fact, in 1 year, I distinctly remember, because I was there in Southeast Asia, when there was actually not a cabinet official actually attending these meetings. And actually, some of the Southeast Asian countries didn't even want to show up to those meetings because they signal some disrespect from the Trump administration. You haven't seen that from the Biden administration. So I think irrespective of wherever I've been in Southeast Asia, there is acknowledgement that the diplomatic side has improved. I think even on the economic side, to be fair, I see a lot of commentary coming out of Washington and sort of a lot in the media about IPEF and its limitations. I actually think a lot of the countries in the region are looking forward. Nobody is interested in relitigating debates about CPTPP or IPEF or so on and so forth. Everybody knows its limitations. What people are looking for is that one point you raised, which is what are countries actually going to deliver on these? And so the Biden administration has come up with a lot of initiatives, which is better than, and again, this is all a relative comparison. It's better than what we saw in the Trump administration, which was a series of discussions around trade deficits, countries bending over backwards to kind of explain sanctions. So it's a relative improvement. But if you're going to compare this to China, I would absolutely agree with you that the United States has a long way to go. I would say if you look at the dimensions, I think you have to be very careful about what specific aspects of statecraft you're talking about. I think on trade, if you look at the figures, the Chinese are going on almost sort of 1 trillion. Relative to the U.S., which is 500, 600 billion. But if you look at investment, actually...
Yeah, FDI, they're much bigger, the Americans.
Exactly. So I think we have to be very careful about what we're talking about. Not a single data point, but looking at things a lot more comprehensively. And I think that's what I worry about for the Trump administration. I think what you saw a lot more attention to these security issues, but not a lot of diplomatic engagement with ASEAN, not a lot of focus on positive, affirmative economic visions there. But again, I mean, in Southeast Asia, you'll also hear complaints about the Biden administration on things like human rights and democracy, right? Some of these countries feel like the Biden administration has put this view of democracies versus autocracies as too much of a binary view. And they feel, rightly or wrongly, that even though in the United States there was a big discussion about Trump and what it would mean for democracy, some of these regimes that are not very democratic feel like they might actually get less heat from a Trump administration on a lot of their democratic and human rights issues at home. And that might actually be a good thing for some of these Southeast Asian officials. And I think the general mindset you get in Southeast Asia, and I got this on my last trip, was that, under Trump, it's going to be very transactional, much more transactional. And with Harris, you're going to see, perhaps a little bit more similarity and a little bit more continuity on the sort of relative to the Biden administration's policies. But the bigger picture, as I think we both would agree on, Eric, is that I think on U.S. policy in Southeast Asia, Southeast Asians tend to view this very comprehensively. So you not only have to get the security piece right, you've got to get the diplomatic piece right, you've got to get the economic piece right, you've got to walk a fine balance on democracy, human rights. And also, you've got to be seen as working with allies and partners, which I think the Biden administration has been doing a lot more relative to the Trump administration and some of these new minilaterals and so on and so forth. And so I think that's where we're at in Southeast Asia. A lot of questions about U.S. engagement. But as I said up top when we started our discussion, it's really important for us to keep in mind that as we talk about these big security and geopolitical issues, there are lots of bread and butter issues that matter for Southeast Asians, both Southeast Asian elites and governments and also publics, particularly after the COVID-19 pandemic. People are looking at a lot more of these economic issues in particular sectors, whether it's infrastructure, climate change, the digital economy, and so on and so forth. And I think those issues really are where hopefully we'll get a lot more focus on, even though I enjoy a lot talking about these big flashpoints like Myanmar and the South China Sea. I think that's what we try to do a lot in ASEAN Wonk, kind of focusing on the geopolitics, but also the geoeconomics and domestic economic foreign policy and security questions.
Well, you recently did an edition focused on Vietnam's late General Secretary Nguyen Phu Trong and his passing. He passed away on Friday, July 19th. Trong was a pivotal figure in Vietnamese politics. For 12 years, he really sat at the very tip top, at the apex of the communist hierarchy and served an unprecedented 3 terms as party chief in 3 decades in the Politburo. And he is one of, in many respects, the founding fathers of modern Vietnam in the post-1975 war era. No doubt, though, he represented a conservative Marxist-Leninist faction within the party and was widely seen as a hardliner in many respects. But he will be remembered in part for 2 main things. Number one, domestically, a decade-long anti-corruption drive that produced, I would say, mixed results, and I think that's the prevailing consensus. It intensified in the last years of his life under a campaign known as Blazing Furnace. That anti-corruption drive, and it's been fascinating over the past year, and I live in Vietnam and have been following this, has resulted in dramatic political upheaval that has claimed 7 of the 15 members of the powerful Politburo. The Politburo is kind of like the cabinet. It's the group that runs the country. It's where the power is centered. And imagine half of them wiped out, including a former president as well. Thousands of lower-level officials have also been jailed or fired from their state jobs. And I can tell you, as somebody who does live in Vietnam, and I've been there for 12 years, and I meet regularly with scholars, think tankers, and analysts, they have all told me quietly, and you can feel it actually, that this is the most political instability that they've seen in this country since the end of the war on April 30th, 1975. I mean, there is real unease about where this is all going. Right now, the president is now serving as the acting general secretary. His name is To Lam. He was the former Minister of Public Security. Believe it or not, for a guy who's been in the public eye for a very long time, very little is known about him. So in addition to the anti-corruption drives that Trong was famous for, he's also famous for pioneering a strategy in foreign policy known as bamboo diplomacy. Some of you who listen to the show may have heard this before. The idea is that bamboo bends with the winds, it's very strong, and it doesn't break under pressure. And that's how they defined their foreign policy. And in many ways, this is a foreign policy that has been a benchmark, a role model for other middle power countries. And we're seeing it emulated now in Cambodia, also in the Philippines, and in countries like Kenya, where they are balancing the great powers. And not even just the superpowers, China and the US, but also other powers like Japan, India, Indonesia. These are all major powers in Asia that the Vietnamese have all struck and elevated their diplomatic relationships. Prashanth, you have done this fantastic job. Every time Vietnam upgrades its diplomatic ties with the country, you have these great grids in your newsletter, which shows who are the comprehensive strategic partners, who are the others. And the United States, in fact, last year was upgraded as well. But let's talk about the U.S. very quickly. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was supposed to attend Trong's memorial in Hanoi last week. He canceled at the last minute so he could attend a White House meeting with visiting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Let's just say that did not go down well at all in Vietnam. And you've talked about the absenteeism of U.S. diplomacy. Here is another example. And let me read you a tweet from Boston College Vietnam political scientist Cang Vu, who wrote, quote, Secretary of State Blinken missing General Secretary Trong's funeral is not making the U.S. look good in the eyes of Vietnamese netizens. Some pointed out that the U.S. is the only comprehensive strategic partner that did not send a high-ranking delegation to the funeral. Let's contrast that with President Xi Jinping's response. Within hours, mere hours of General Secretary Trong's passing, Xi went personally to the Vietnamese embassy in Beijing, flanked by the Communist Party's top diplomat, Liu Jianchao, and also Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. That is some heavy firepower and is an indication in many respects of the priority that Xi placed not only on his relationship with Vietnam, but also his peer relationship with General Secretary Trong. Because remember, of all Xi Jinping's jobs that he holds, General Secretary of the Communist Party is in fact more important in many respects than his title as president. So he saw himself as peers. And one little final thought, don't forget that when the pandemic ended, it was Trong who was the first foreign leader that Xi met in Beijing after they started to loosen up their travel. So the relationship is deep. You wrote about this. You said Trong's departure will raise questions about how Vietnam's foreign policy evolves in a challenging domestic and international context. Can you reflect very briefly, because we're running out of time, but can you reflect on Nguyen Phu Trong and the impact that it's going to have on bamboo diplomacy and Vietnam's foreign policy?
Yeah, I think you're right, Eric, to note that it's a very consequential development. I think if you look at Vietnam and you kind of zoom out, it is a country, as you said, that is within Southeast Asia one of the most adept at balancing these various major powers and including attracting investment from these various powers, right? So it's a kind of country that is doing pretty well relative to the rest of Southeast Asia. But I think there are questions that are being raised. You pointed out, a lot of the instability that we've seen in Vietnam. If you talk to Vietnamese officials, when I was there on my last trip, and I was there again late last year after Xi Jinping had visited Vietnam, there were a lot of questions about not necessarily how Vietnam is doing its major power balancing externally, but what are its internal developments looking like in terms of domestic political transitions, economic management, and also looking ahead to the Party Congress that's coming up in 2026, which seems like it's far away, but actually by Vietnamese standards, it's not, right? Because it's a very important development, and a lot of the political maneuvering that happens domestically happens well in advance of the Party Congress. And so I think a lot of people are going to be looking at how this domestic political maneuvering happens within the next year, year and a half. I would also say, frankly, if you talk to Vietnamese officials, there's a lot of triumphalism that you see come out of the media, particularly in the Western media. It's kind of very kind of surface level. Vietnam has hosted, this many leaders. But actually, if you talk to officials themselves, they're a lot more humble and modest about those accomplishments, and they're actually focused a lot more on how do we actually implement these things and how do we actually get the specifics ironed out. So whether it's the U.S. elevation to a comprehensive strategic partnership, where we have yet to see actually a lot of the big announcements that were announced on things like semiconductors and so on and so forth, lots of work that needs to be done on that. We're starting to see a little bit more of some of the agreements that were reached between Vietnam and China on things like infrastructure come out, but there's still a lot more work to be done in terms of that major power balancing. And also, I would say, frankly, as well, if you talk to businesses, there are still, in spite of the fact that Vietnam, if you look at the FDI figures and the government publishes this, is very transparent about this. And, you see the kind of sources there. The U.S. matters, and China as well, but you've got South Korea, Japan, and other sources as well, Singapore, through which a lot of regional kind of funding moves as well. There are a lot of sort of lingering issues around how to diversify this investment beyond the usual suspects, the countries, but also the different sectors. You look at FDI now, it's mostly, around 75% of this comes from 4 or 5 countries and just a few sectors like manufacturing and real estate. So there needs to be a lot more diversification. But if you look at things like the tech sector, for example, there are a lot of concerns until recently about data localization in Vietnam. If you look at the energy sector, there have been issues like power shortages. And so I think Vietnamese officials know full well that even though Vietnam, relatively speaking, is a bright spot in terms of investment and in terms of foreign policy balancing, they themselves know that they have a lot of work to do. And the leadership succession and various domestic political maneuverings that we're seeing with respect to leadership changes is one facet of that. And it's going to be really interesting to watch how this plays out over the next year or so.
Well, there's no doubt that this is going to be a lot of what you're going to cover in the next year in ASEAN Wonk. If people want to sign up and follow what you're doing, where can they subscribe to ASEAN Wonk?
To subscribe, you can go to www.aseanwonk.com. That's www.aseanwonk.com. And can I just say, Eric, that I continue to enjoy your work for the China Global South Project. You guys do a terrific job of covering really an extensive array of countries, but also I'm more kind of really struck by how good of a job you do in covering the various sectors and issues that we've talked about. So not really just the geopolitical or security issues, but really like the economic issues, informational kind of narrative issues. And as you know as well as I do, we've discussed this before, the Global South, over the last few years has been getting a little bit more attention from Western countries. But I think there's really a lot more that needs to be done to hear the voices and the narratives of individual countries and people coming from the region. And the voices that you've had on this podcast, including from countries like Southeast Asia, really has been a terrific resource. And so I really applaud you and the team for the work that you continue to do.
I can't thank you enough for that. That's high praise coming from you, and I do appreciate it. And I'm just going to recommend, you beat me to the punch here, but I was just going to tell everybody that ASEAN Wonk is indispensable. I use it in the daily coverage that I do. It comes out twice a week, and it's funny because it's one of the newsletters that I actually go back to. A lot of newsletters that you get, you kind of read, delete, read, delete, read, delete. But I find myself actually going back to what you write throughout the course of a week, and it's absolutely fantastic. So I'm going to put a link to Prashanth's newsletter in the show notes so you can subscribe to ASEAN Wonk. Prashanth, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It's always so enlightening to have your insights on these very complex issues, especially of the fact that you were just in Manila and Hanoi and able to share some of those perspectives with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Eric. It's really great to be with you and really enjoyed the conversation.
Fantastic. And so Copus and I will be back again next week with another edition of the China Global South podcast. Copus is on leave this week, but he'll be back with me next week behind the mic. So until then, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back again next week with another edition of the China Global South podcast.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.